Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And at the outset, I just want to acknowledge two very dear friends of mine who are in the gallery this evening, Tom and James, because their experience very much informs much of where I come from in this debate. And I remember being in Dubbo some time ago now, walking the dogs with Tom when he told me he was going to get married. And of course I was overwhelmed by joys that your friends are embarking on such a joyous occasion, but the reality very quickly set in to me that clearly that wedding wasn't going to take place in Australia. Fortunately, they found themselves some fabulous Conservative member of Parliament from Copenhagen that was able to marry them, and we got to celebrate many months later with all of the family and friends here in Canberra. But this bill that is before us tonight, this bill that was passed by the Senate last week, is going to ensure that every other LGBTI person in Australia doesn't have to go overseas, doesn't have to run from their communities, from their family, from their extended families and loved ones to take part in that moment that should be indeed shared with everyone you love in your life at that time. So, Deputy Speaker, I feel the sense of history very much tonight in this House. The people of Australia have voted yes, have made their intention very clear. The Senate has likewise voted yes last week for marriage equality, and really now it's time for this House to do our job that I think we should have done a long time ago, I might add, and make marriage equality law in Australia. By the end of this week, we should indeed be free of the last remaining piece of discriminatory law for LGBTIQ Australians. Finally, federal law will in fact reflect the basic truth that same-sex couples' love is just as real and that their relationship is just as valid as any other. Finally, people in same-sex relationships will be able to join marriages that heterosexual couples have just taken for granted for probably way too long. And finally, federal law will align with the values of the majority of Australians. I could not be more proud to be the representative for the City of Newcastle in this chamber tonight, because Newcastle was a city that returned an overwhelming yes vote when the question was put. In fact, 74.8% of my community in Newcastle voted yes. It was the highest voting electorate in New South Wales outside of Sydney, and it was indeed the highest regional yes vote in Australia. And I can't say that I was utterly surprised in the sense that it was long the message I had gained from my community over many, many years debating this issue. I also know that Novocastrians have a really deeply embedded sense of fairness. And even though a lot of people have approached the question of marriage equality from quite a lot of different angles, in Newcastle that sense of fairness and what is right was so palpable that when given the opportunity to say, do you think people of same sex should have the right to marry like every other Australians? Almost without hesitation, I would say people were voting yes. And I knew that because when I first stood for Parliament back in 2012 as a candidate, I attended many of the forums, like we all do when we're running for election community debates, and I can recall being asked time and again, where did I stand on the question of marriage equality? Because in those days it wasn't party policy, Deputy Speaker. It was a conscience vote for the Labor Party when I was first standing. And I decided there and then that I would just have to be straight up with the electors of Newcastle, that I couldn't compromise on a really fundamental principle. Having spent my entire life fighting discrimination of one kind or another, or being an advocate in that field, I could not for one moment contemplate not completing the job of this parliament. I acknowledge here the great work of the former Labor parliament in removing some 85 separate pieces of discrimination from some 85 separate pieces of legislation, but this marriage law was the one final hurdle we hadn't got to. So it is absolutely time for this parliament to address this issue now. And when I was asked, where would I stand and where was my position, I had to, and I was very happy to look my electorate in the eye at every rally, every forum, and say, I will be, if ever I get the opportunity in the Australian Parliament to cast a vote on this issue, I will vote a resounding yes. And Madam Speaker, I've got to say that for even those people, those 25% of Novocastrians who haven't casted a yes vote, they nonetheless have respect for both my position, for the majority position of the electorate, and indeed the fact that I have just been truthful and upfront about that position from day one. And that's what Novocastrians, like many people in Australia, I'm sure, they want to know you're going to be straight with them on any given issue. You can hold a difference of opinion, but you just need to be able to explain your position. The only thing I regret is having just slightly missed out on making it into the top 10 count in the in the overall results for Australia. Although I do acknowledge that I was pipped to the post by the member for Warringah's electorate that came in that 10th position, and that news was greeted with a peculiar kind of satisfaction for me, I guess. But I nonetheless was so extremely proud of the people of Newcastle. I think tonight, in the time that I have remaining, Deputy Speaker, I really wanted to acknowledge some of the really long-standing and fearless advocates who have been important people in my life, I guess, who have been champions in my community, who laid the foundations really for much of for the legislation that comes before us tonight. And I want to first acknowledge my deep and now late friend Paul O'Grady, who was the first elected openly gay man in any Australian parliament. Sadly, I lost Paul a few years ago, but he actually wasn't that fussed about marriage himself. The love of his life had died several years beforehand, and but Paul was nonetheless a fierce advocate of social justice, fairness, decency, democracy, and stood up every time to be counted against discrimination. You can't imagine what it would have been like being a young man in 1988 being elected into the New South Wales upper house on a platform of being openly gay. He told me stories that were just horrifying at the time, but he never ever retreated from being that fearless advocate who looked discrimination straight in the eye and took it on. I'd also like to pay a special acknowledgement to my predecessor and the former member of Newcastle, Sharon Claydon, who was so rock solid in her support for marriage equality. I don't know if she's listening in tonight, but I know that I got to see her the night of the results of the survey, and the smile on her face really said it all. I mean, on this issue, she was well and truly ahead of her time, Deputy Speaker, being the first parliamentarian to ever sign the Australian Marriage Equality's Charter of Equality. At the time, I remember I was a slightly younger member on her staff, and we were all like, oh my God, this is not ALP policy, you've just signed this pledge. And she looked at me and said, Sharon, you know, this is an issue I care deeply about. I am a member of the ALP, I'm a fierce and passionate Novocastrian, but I'm a human and this is a human rights issue. So she had the courage to sign that charter at a time when very few did, I've got to say. Thankfully that has changed now. She signed that charter and had to wait another she signed that charter in 2016. She had to wait another 6 years to be able to cast a yes vote in this chamber. Regretfully, the time was not ripe, and that yes vote did not carry in that, at that time. She's waiting another 5 years for that yes to become a reality, and I hope that we in the chamber tonight or very soon will in fact give her great heart and encouragement that those initial steps she took and really did help pave the way for those of us that come after. I also want to give a shout out to a very dear friend, Michelle Lancy. I don't know if she is listening tonight, but I expect she will be. Michelle, a very strong Christian woman I've known for a very long time. Michelle has 3 kids, one of whom is gay. So she has never for a moment doubted that every single one of her kids deserves the same rights as each other. And she has been a fearless advocate in my community. She heads up PFLAG, the Parents and Friends of Lesbian and Gay Children, and along with her national spokesperson, Sally Argent, have led a formidable campaign for decades around this issue. So I want to pay a tribute to Michelle Lancy tonight, to the people of Acon Hunter, to all of the advocates and warriors who have spent decades of their lives championing this cause. I think it is fit that we acknowledge those that come before us, which is why I've attempted to put on record some of that tonight. And of course in this chamber and in the House opposite, when I think about the journey that my friend, colleague Senator Penny Wong has been on, both within the Labor Party and in the Australian Parliament over such a long period of time, it is utterly unimaginable to really have walked in her shoes through what were some pretty horrific times over the last decade or so in this parliament around this issue. But she never gave up. She never gave up. And so, despite however tough it has seemed from time to time, I have never allowed myself the luxury of, saying this is too hard and ever thinking it wasn't worth pursuing, because for the LGBTI community in Australia are relying on us to stand up here in this parliament and do the right thing now. They've waited a very, very long time, and the time really has come. When I asked Tom earlier tonight, before they left Nyngan to join us in this debate tonight, what message he might want to portray in this debate tonight, he said to me, "Who would have known that a chance meeting 15 years ago in the Nyngan RSL would lead to he and James now settling in that small country town, and that just how thankful they are that their friends and community have been so incredibly supportive and accepting of their relationship." But they made the point that I do want to end on this evening, that they were surprised themselves just how the impact that this National Postal Survey has had on them. Their retreat from social media for several weeks or months really matches much of the experiences of young men and women, in particular in my community, who just, when the yes vote came in, it was, you know, an utter sense of relief more than anything that this this perpetual judgment on their relationship would finally come to an end.